Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning into this solo episode, which is pretty special because it marks the beginning of a brand new series within the podcast. The title of this series is The Redemption Arc, and it is going to be about my personal bodybuilding experience. Normally, as you know, my podcast alternates guest interviews with solo episodes where I take a deep dive or do a deep dive into a specific topic about training, nutrition, or lifestyle. Whereas in the Redemption Arc series, I'm going to be focusing specifically on what I'm doing right now and how my personal bodybuilding experience is developing. I'm thinking of doing an update on this maybe once a month, but I'm going to see how it goes, and I'm not going to record an update unless I think that it's going to add some value. And I do believe that my experience will be valuable because I may be more experienced than some of you listeners, and I believe that any individual's experience can be just as valuable as the research that I normally talk about, because while research is really helpful to give us a direction, every individual is going to have a slightly different body, a slightly different psychology and background, and therefore they will need a slightly different approach. So I think that this will be fun for you to listen to, just as it will be fun for me to record. So let's start with an explanation of the title. Why Redemption Arc? Well, the main reason is that I feel like I've not been able to build muscle to my full potential. To be fully transparent, I've actually felt a little bit like an imposter because I've obviously kept talking about bodybuilding and how passionate I am about it. And I've been coaching my clients through cutting and building phases, whereas I haven't been able to follow quite the same approach for myself. So I think I'm going to give you a quick rundown of my personal history since September 2022 so that you can understand where I'm coming from here. So at that time, in September 2022, my plan was to start my next bulk. At this point, I was the leanest I've ever been. I had the lowest amount of body fat and the greatest amount of muscle mass I've had to date, because I had just spent 6 months and a half preparing for a photo shoot where I wanted to be that lean and that muscular. So with the photo shoot wrapped up in August, I was thinking, let's go into another bulk in September. Unfortunately, at that time, I came down with some major gut health issues. I actually even got a chest infection for at least a couple of weeks, but the most relevant change in my health was these major gut health issues that resulted in daily constipation, abdominal pain, a lack of appetite, and terrible bloating. So I couldn't cut and bulk properly for a whole year while I was getting that sorted. Finally, in November 2023, I was fine. I was finally recovered from this whole ordeal. I kid you not, this was one of the darkest times in my adult life. So at this time, in November 2023, I'm thinking, all right, it seems like I can finally start bulking properly. And then in January 2024, I found out that I was going to get top surgery in August, which was super exciting, but also it wasn't much time. And I favor really long bulking phases where you gain weight very gradually because you can't force feed muscle growth. So that would have been my preference. But if I only had 7 months between January and the date of the surgery, I couldn't have fit that kind of bulk and also the kind of fat loss phase required to get as lean as I would have wanted to be for the first surgery. So in the end, I prioritized this procedure, and so I stayed leaner. I did go into a bit of a surplus, but it was for a very short amount of time, so that I could spend an equally short amount of time or similarly short amount of time cutting back down to be as lean as I would have wanted to be to get the results that I desired. Now, top surgery happened in August 2024. Awesome. And then recovery took about 6 weeks. So we're talking the end of August up to the beginning of October 2024. That's when I finally thought, at last, let this bulk commence. And I did bulk, but I was very dissatisfied with the results. I found myself gaining weight very quickly, eating barely 1900 calories a day. And to give you some context, I used to maintain my weight on 2000 calories when I had similar activity levels and I had less muscle back in 2021. Because we're talking 3 years where, yes, my health was compromised, but I always showed up to training and I always took care of my nutrition to the best of my abilities, even though I couldn't cut and bulk. So I definitely had more muscle at this point in time in October 2024. It just seemed so strange that this would be happening to me. In addition to that, when I took physique pictures and compared them over time, I felt like I was gaining more fat than I was muscle the whole time, which hadn't been my experience in previous bulks. As it turns out, my thyroid wasn't working properly. And the thyroid is a powerful metabolic regulator. And when it's not working properly, and in my case it was underactive, so I had hypothyroidism, hypothyroidism is going to compromise your ability to gain muscle, but also, and it's probably going to be more noticeable when you're trying to lose body fat. Although it could be noticeable in both cases actually, because what actually happens if the thyroid is underactive is that for your size and activity levels, you're burning fewer calories than the norm. So that's what happened in my case. That's why I was bulking in quotation marks in so few, on such a small caloric intake. Now, my thyroid issues had actually been going on for several years at this point. I've had thyroid issues for the majority of my adult life. But a few years ago, I started getting medication for these issues. And it took me several years of tracking my data pretty meticulously to put together the pieces and realize that that medication wasn't appropriate. Once I realized that this was happening, I had been through a gaining phase that I was dissatisfied with. I'd been through a 9 week fat loss phase that had also been torturous because just like I bulked on very few calories, I also needed far fewer calories that I'm used to in order to lose fat. And then when I returned to maintenance, maintenance still felt like a deficit. So this affected my quality of life to a large extent because honestly, I like to eat. And I felt like I always had to hold myself back from eating the kind of food and the amount of food and variety that would have made me feel happy about my diet because if I went above 1800 calories, I would start gaining weight. In any case, at this point, I did put together all the pieces. This was September 2025, and I realized that I needed some more help with my thyroid. So at first, I thought, given the hypothesis, I can't say that word today for some reason. I had a certain hypothesis as to why my thyroid was underactive or what could be contributing to it. And my doctor and another endocrinologist also kind of confirmed that hypothesis. So I thought that I could potentially improve on my thyroid levels by taking an approach to training and nutrition whereby I was trying to reduce my stress levels and improve my recovery. So this was at the start of September 2025, apologies, and I spent 12 weeks trying out that approach. And then I decided that if I wasn't going to see any change, I would see a private endocrinologist. I did not see the changes I wanted to see, unfortunately. So 12 weeks later, end of November, I believe, I finally got seen by an endocrinologist who understood my situation and gave me the right medication. So I spent the following number of weeks. In total, I spent 26 weeks in what I call this metabolic restoration phase, titrating my medication up to the right dosage. During this time, my intention was to build muscle. So I didn't want to be in a deficit. And initially, I thought I would be at maintenance, but I also decided that I wasn't going to stop a surplus if it occurred. And I couldn't be sure whether this would happen or not. I never used that kind of medication, so I didn't know what kind of effect it would have once my metabolism started ramping up. So this is a long preamble to explain that I don't feel like I've been able to go through the kind of cutting and bulking phases that I prefer, so long gaining phases followed by appropriately long cutting phases, for various health-related reasons, and because of these underlying thyroid issues that I've been developing symptoms of ever since 2021, so 5 whole years of this at this point. Well, almost 5 really, because I started getting the proper medication in 2025. So with these underlying issues that were affecting my metabolism, I simply felt like I couldn't build muscle to the extent that my body is actually capable of when my thyroid is working as it should. Now, as of last week, I saw my endocrinologist again. She and I were both happy with the way I feel and the medication dosage I'm on right now. So for the time being, for at least the next 6 months, there aren't going to be any changes. And I thought that this was the perfect opportunity to finally start my redemption arc, which is going to feature a change in my nutrition and in my training to finally achieve my overarching goal of building as much muscle as I am capable of. Before I get into that, I want to circle back to what I said about the thyroid affecting my ability to build muscle and lose fat. So it was very obvious that my maintenance calories were suppressed because I was maintaining my weight on 1800 calories, and now that my medication is at a stable dose, I'm maintaining between 21 and 2200 calories. So we're talking about a 3 to 400 calorie difference, which is very significant. As for to what extent this might have prevented me to build muscle as much as I would have been able to if my thyroid had been working well, I have no clue, because obviously I don't live in I can't see a parallel universe where this didn't happen to me. And in addition to that, we also have some confounding factors, namely the year-long gut health issues that I also had to deal with that prevented me from cutting and bulking. I just had really no appetite, and I was so bloated that I just tried not to get into an accidental deficit because I didn't want to eat, essentially. But I certainly was in no position to bulk, because when your gut isn't in the right place, when the problem is affecting your lifestyle to that extent, it's probably also going to affect your ability to build muscle, because you can only build as much muscle as the nutrients that we have allow, because we need nutrients to build that muscle. And if we're not absorbing and processing those nutrients properly, of course, our ability to build muscle is compromised. So I don't exactly know how much this affected my ability to build muscle, but as I said, it certainly affected my ability to lose fat easily, to bulk and enjoy the process of bulking, whereby bulking felt like not even being at maintenance. And as I said, this really affected me psychologically. I was feeling really restricted and therefore less willing to gain weight in any bulking phase that I got the opportunity to do, because if even maintenance felt like a deficit and a surplus felt like a slightly smaller deficit, I really didn't want to bulk and gain weight to the extent that then I would have to cut for a really long time, because I already felt like I was always cutting. So, having said all that, that is all behind me now. Hello, normal life. I am back to where I was prior to 2021, and I am ready to make the most of the next forever. For as long as I can bodybuild for, I definitely will. Now, As I alluded to, my main overarching goal is to build as much muscle as I am capable of. However, when I was debating what to do as the first phase in my redemption arc, I did consider potentially going into a cut. Right now, my physique is in a position where I could go either way. I'm at a healthy weight. I am relatively lean, but not as lean as I necessarily like to be. So I could have cut back down to that level of leanness that I prefer, or I could have started bulking. And ultimately, I know that from a psychological perspective, I'm always pulled towards getting leaner. You could call it my comfort zone. A leaner physique is my comfort zone. So my first instinct was indeed to cut back down to that comfort zone. But then I decided that I was going to bulk instead. Because if I started a cut right now, that would be for the sake of short term gratification. I spent 15 minutes plus in this podcast complaining about how I felt like an imposter, I felt like I wasn't building muscle to my full potential, and then what? I decided to do the exact opposite of what is going to make me build as much muscle as possible for the sake of what? Losing 4 or 5 pounds and get back down to my preferred physique. I didn't think that truly aligned with my vision right now after so long that I had to spend with a suppressed caloric intake. And also, although the medication should keep my thyroid running as it's supposed to, what can affect your thyroid negatively is a prolonged deficit that creates a lot of stress on the body. Now, if your thyroid is already not doing great to begin with, it's possible that even a short deficit that's not particularly aggressive could have a negative impact on it. And since in the grand scheme of things, I've only been on this medication for a few months, and I want to clarify, this is purely my opinion, based on the fact that my preference right now is to be cautious because my body has been in this compromised position for so long. I really don't want to risk anything that could lead to a setback. So I also think that if I bulk first, I'm going to give my thyroid several months of eating in an abundance of calories with the medication also doing its job. So by the time I cut again, my hope is that my body is going to be really responsive to this calorie deficit and also able to handle the stress that comes with it, so that I will not need the same super low calories that I had to diet on in 2025. So again, purely my speculation, but this is what makes me feel more comfortable right now. However, the most important thing that moved the needle for me was the realization that my real long-term goal is muscle growth, and that cannot happen easily in a deficit. And most importantly, it's not going to happen in my comfort zone. If I always try to stay as lean as I like to be, by definition, I wouldn't be bulking very much, if at all, and that is going to compromise my ability to put on muscle. And for other people who are happy with a slower rate of muscle growth, that's actually an excellent strategy. You get as lean as you want to be, and then you hover around maintenance calories and you train hard. And over years of effort, you are most definitely going to build muscle. But I have above average ambitions when it comes to muscle growth, and the best way that I know of to build as much muscle as possible is to go through cutting and bulking cycles. That's why my intention right now is to bulk for the next 12 weeks, commit to 12 weeks of bulking, at the end of which I am going to reassess where I'm at with my physique and what I want to do. So what I'm going to do in the next part of this episode is I am going to run you through what I call a pre-bulking checklist. And this is a checklist of habits that you want to have in place before you embark on a bulk in order to make the most of it, meaning maximize muscle growth and minimize fat loss. Personally, I've been bodybuilding for years. Whether I was cutting and bulking or not, I always maintain these habits. So for me, at this point, they happen on autopilot. It's not like I actually ran through this checklist before starting this first redemption arc phase. However, for you, that might not be the case. So I thought I would list them all to help you if you are about to embark on a similar phase or if you ever will in the future. So these are habits, but also factor that I would want you to consider. The first one is that you want to be lean enough that you don't have issues related to body fat. And these are both physiological issues, meaning you don't carry excess body fat that's posing a risk to your health. So you're not overweight and you don't have obesity. And from a psychological standpoint, the risk in quotation marks that body fat could pose is that it might tempt you into stopping your bulking phase too soon. Because if you're already a bit uncomfortable with the amount of body fat that you carry, then give it a few weeks' time, you will be even more uncomfortable. And if that's the reason why you cut your bulk short, you're also cutting short your ability to build muscle. So you want to achieve a position of leanness where your body is healthy and where also you are happy to give yourself at least, at the bare minimum, 12 weeks to be in a slight surplus. The second consideration is that training needs to be a priority. You want to be training at least 4 times a week. That's usually enough volume for a surplus to yield good results, meaning minimal fat gain and maximal muscle gain. And you also want to rarely miss any of these sessions. Personally, I don't think I've ever missed a session. I always change the plan to a deload if I was injured or if I were ill, but I always did everything in my power to be able to get my sessions done. Your program also needs to be hypertrophy specific because what you're trying to achieve is hypertrophy. So the more specific the plan is to the goal you want to achieve, the better the results you will get. So don't go into a bulking phase with a powerlifting program or a CrossFit program. Last but not least, you want to be using the right form to target the muscles you intend on training, and you want to have a high proximity to failure. So you don't want to be leaving any more than 2 reps in the tank at the end of every set, and you need to be able to assess that. From a nutritional perspective, you want to be tracking your calories and macros and hitting your goals consistently. Now, tracking isn't necessary if you are hitting your nutritional goals without the need for that too. But for most people who haven't spent years bodybuilding, tracking is a really useful approach to make sure that you are hitting these targets. Most importantly, from a nutritional habits standpoint, you want to have a regular meal structure. You want to have a similar number of meals at the same time of day most days, and the same meal and snack composition. I already covered these topics in many podcasts, the first one or the most comprehensive one being episode 54. So I'm not going to. No, it wasn't episode 54. My apologies. Can't remember what episode that was. Episode 48. So if you want to listen to my comprehensive guide to meal prepping and planning, listen to episode 48. Here I'm just going to primarily explain my personal structure, since at the end of the day, this is a podcast about me, right? So right now, as of March 2026, I'm recording on the 19th of March because I wanted this episode to be pretty relevant. Sometimes I record way in advance, but I didn't want to release this episode months or weeks after I've started this phase because otherwise it wouldn't be as relevant anymore. So anyway, as of March 19th, 2026, I'm currently having 3 square meals a day. I have meal 1, which is my breakfast and my pre-workout meal. Meal 2, which is at lunchtime for me, and it's right after training, or shortly after training anyway. I do shower before I eat, just in case you're wondering. And then I have my dinner, which is going to be my final meal in the day. And I normally try to keep my ingredient selection to a minimum. I'm going for 1 protein source, 1 carbohydrate source, starchy carbohydrate source, and then fruit and vegetables, which I mix up. It's not a problem if I have 2 or 3 different vegetables. Actually, it's great because I'm trying to aim for 30 plants per week for gut health purposes. In any case, I have a mix of fruit and vegetables, and then depending on how many calories I have left for that particular meal, I will have a source of fat and or some form of condiment. Well, usually I have a condiment, but it may not be calorific. It may just be herbs and spices and salt. At the end of a meal, not every meal, but at the end of my meal two and meal three, or rather, as an accompaniment to these meals, I would have my main meal and then I would have a dessert. Or it could be a snack if I eat it at different times of day. But honestly, based on my schedule right now, I don't like stopping in the middle of the afternoon or in the middle of the morning, stopping work mid-afternoon, mid-morning, just to have a snack. I find it easier to add these snacks onto meals two and three. So basically, I have desserts, and that's usually something that is missing from the rest of my diet up to that point. So if I've fulfilled my protein goal for the day, but my fiber is a little bit low, I'll go for something a bit more carbohydrate rich to increase that fiber. If everything has already been hit, so protein and fiber, um, my baseline micronutrients, they're all covered to the best of my ability, then it might be something more highly palatable if I have the available calories, like a pastry or something of that nature. You want to make sure that you have not the same, but that you have a meal exoskeleton like mine. From what I've told you, the way I think about planning my meals is I'm thinking about, okay, what's my protein source? What's my carb source? What's my fat? What's my condiment? And what's my dessert? So this is my meal exoskeleton, and it covers all of my nutritional bases. And then I can choose to increase portions or make some food swaps or a combination of the two, depending on the phase that I am in. Now that I'm going to be in a surplus, I am going to switch some of my food choices to something that's a little bit lower in volume compared to when I'm at maintenance, and definitely compared to when I'm in a deficit, because I don't want to spend 3 hours eating a meal because it can be such a big portion in a surplus compared to when I'm in a deficit. So, for example, when I'm in a deficit, I tend to choose a lower calorie type of bread. Bread is one of my staples. If you've listened to my podcast long enough, you will know. But basically, I would choose something like a lower calorie ciabatta bread. Whereas now that I'm in a surplus, I am pulling out one of my favorites, naan bread, which is higher in calories for a similar portion, if not a smaller portion. And that would be an example of making a swap while maintaining the exact same meal exoskeleton. Whereas for breakfast, I'm really enjoying oats at the moment. So in a deficit, I would have a smaller portion of oats. At maintenance, I also had a slightly smaller portion. Now that I'm in a surplus, I've simply increased the portion. So I wanted to give you two examples. An example of making a swap to change the amount of volume that you're eating, and and an increasing portion instead. So you've got both now. The last three considerations to make and habits to consider are sleep, stress management, and your health status. So you want to make sure that you have a solid sleep routine, because sleep is really important for muscle growth. I don't expect that you will be perfect and having excellent nights every single night, but you want to feel refreshed when you wake up, and you want to be having the same bedtime and same wake up time most days to regulate your circadian rhythm, your sleep circadian rhythm. So you want to have some solid sleep habits in place. You want to have solid stress management strategies in place as well. And the name implies the goal. You want to be managing your stress. Nobody is ever going to have a completely stress-free life, and that's not the goal. But you want to be in a position where you are handling the stressors that you're under well. Because if you are not in a position to endure more stress, training hard in a bulking phase is stressful, and also a surplus to an extent can produce a little bit of stress on the body in a similar way to what a prolonged calorie deficit can do. It depends on the person. Some people are more sensitive than others. Point being, you want your stress management to be supporting you. Finally, as for health status, all I'm saying is don't start a bulk if you're looking after a pretty significant aspect of your health. For example, the reason why I didn't go through an intentional bulk up until this week was that I was waiting for my endocrinologist to tell me we're no longer increasing or changing your thyroid medication dosages, because every time there was a change, my body had to adjust. I wanted my body to have pretty predictable responses to ensure that I would be healthy throughout this phase. and also less stressed out about having to have all of these medication changes and dealing with the resulting symptoms. And just to clarify, the reason I've been saying that I wasn't intentionally bulking is that I did gain about 5 pounds from the beginning of this metabolic restoration phase in September. And the reason was, as my body was adjusting to the medication and my metabolism was ramping up, for a period of time, my hunger increased quite a lot. And it was genuine hunger. It wasn't appetite. It wasn't me wanting to eat. I would get to the end of the day and I would have a hole in my stomach for several weeks. So I ended up eating in a little bit of a surplus because I thought I really don't want to put my body in a place where I'm compromising energy availability in any way, because one of the main reasons why my thyroid wasn't working so well was reduced energy availability. So I thought either I eat around maintenance or I allow myself to gain a little bit of weight to make sure that my thyroid is going to be working better. And I'm pretty pleased because overall I ended up going through an unintentional but very controlled bulk, because over the course of these 26 weeks of these uh, metabolic restoration phase, which is what, 6 months and a half, I think. Yeah, 6 months and a half. I only gained about 5 pounds, which is for my size pretty appropriate to the rate of gain that I would be looking at anyway. Anyway, I just wanted to make that clarification. And now I want to move on to what's new in this redemption arc phase for me. And the main difference is my training program. So I want to explain how it's changed, because training is the priority in a bulking phase. So if I didn't go into detail about this, what would I even be doing here? First, I'm going to talk you through my previous program. And this was a program that I followed from the start of the metabolic restoration phase. And the program dates back to when I was trying to improve my thyroid output through lifestyle changes. And I alluded to the fact that I was trying to improve my ability to recover, because my theory is that if my thyroid problems were necessarily caused by being under chronic stress, I can't know that for sure, because there could be a genetic component to my hypothyroidism. And also, it could have to do with the fact that for years I was undernourishing myself due to the eating disorder I had. Anyway, there are many reasons. I don't know quite where these thyroid problems came from. But the point is, if this chronic stress that I was under for years didn't cause the hypothyroidism, it certainly didn't help it. And chronic long-term stress can definitely have a negative impact on your thyroid. So my goal was to reduce this chronic stress with the factors under my control. I'm a really high-strung person and I work really hard for long hours, and that was not going to change. It was not under my control. But my training, my steps, and my nutrition were under my control. So nutrition-wise, I didn't want the stress of a deficit. Training-wise, I reduced my volume to be able to recover better, because another side effect of my thyroid issues is that my recovery was terrible. My sleep was pretty shit. My digestion wasn't great, even though I was recovered from the majority of my gut health issues. The chronic constipation stuck around, unfortunately. But also, I would wake up and feel really tired, and by 4 or 5 p.m., I would be exhausted every single day. Whereas now, I wake up, and whether I've had a good night's sleep or a less good night's sleep, I feel pretty refreshed. I cannot believe how much my life has changed in that way. So, in any case, I forgot what I was saying here. All right, so my recovery was reduced. My recovery capacity was reduced. So I reduced my volume to try to improve on that. So I decided to reduce my volume in order to allow for better recovery. So I started training instead of 5 times a week, I decided to train 4 times a week. And I also reduced my steps from 12 to 13,000, which is where I was keeping them, in an attempt to increase, without any particular success, my total energy expenditure. Because as I've said, I like to eat. And if I need to be a little bit more active to eat a bit more, I'll do it. But clearly it wasn't working. So I brought my steps down to around 10,000 per day. And so this initial program was a 4-day program. And I really wanted to focus on my quads and my triceps. So those two muscle groups had slightly higher volume than the others. And the split was lower with a focus on quads, upper, lower with a focus on quads again, and then upper. So lower, upper, lower, 4 times a week. And then once I got on the medication and I started feeling a lot better, I thought that I could increase my volume back to something I was more used to. So change my frequency back to 5 times per week, which is my preferred frequency, because I thought I could recover better now. And lo and behold, I was correct. But I was also still in the same metabolic restoration phase. So I thought, I'm not going to change my program so soon. I'm going to wait until I move on to my next phase. So instead of changing my program, I started training 5 times a week. So once I did my first 4 sessions, I would just start over from session 1, which meant that some weeks I would do 3 upper sessions, and some weeks I would do 3 lower sessions, alternating. Now, in this redemption arc phase, I decided that I wanted to focus on all muscles a little bit more evenly. So I wasn't necessarily focusing on one or two over the others, or I'm not going to. However, this doesn't mean that the volume is the same for all muscles, because over years and years of bodybuilding, I've collected enough data to know that certain muscles require more volume for me to grow at a significant pace compared to others. Or I don't want to mischaracterize what I'm saying. It's not like I can accurately measure how much muscle I'm putting on in certain body parts. What I mean is that I've noticed that I can recover and do more volume on certain muscles versus others while seeing progressive overload. And since from the research I'm aware of, there seems to be a connection, a relationship between volume and hypertrophy, whereby more volume, if you can see progressive overload and recover, does seem to produce more hypertrophy. It's just that it has diminishing returns. So going from 2 sets to 4 is going to yield more hypertrophy than going from 18 to 20. Anyway, this means that, yes, my focus is a little bit more whole body, but some muscles still have more volume than others. For example, my back grows relatively well on for example, my back doesn't need as much volume as my chest. My back is actually a really strong point for me. It grows pretty easily, relatively speaking. And my quads still have a lot of volume because that's what they seem to be doing well with, at least at this moment in time. So, because I was making these relatively significant changes to my volume, I also decided to change my splits. And I am experimenting with a split that I've wanted to try for a long time. Instead of training upper, lower, like I have done historically, I've also followed other splits like push-pull legs, upper, lower. I basically always trained 5 days a week in different ways. This is the first time I'm trying the following split, which is I basically took one muscle for the upper body, one muscle for the lower body, and I paired them together. And then I added some smaller muscle groups like abs, lateral delts, biceps, and triceps to the end of certain workouts. And I decided to pair together muscles that for me require more volume and less volume, so that I don't end up with a muscle that needs to be trained with 20 sets paired with a muscle that only requires 10. The reason for that is that as a result, I was able to build the following split. So the muscles that require more volume for me are I'm talking about major muscle groups here. So for the upper body, it would be my chest, and for the lower body, it would be my quads. I do have a lot of volume for my delts, and I do consider the shoulders a major muscle group, but I primarily trained my lateral delts. That's why I'm not really taking them into account here. And I kind of pair them together with chest to an extent in my head, because I have introduced a shoulder press movement, and I consider presses to fall under a similar category. Anyway, that's beside the point. The point is, I have 3 sessions in a week that are quads and chest focused. And I have 2 sessions in a week that are hamstrings and back focused. And as I said, at the end of the session, I add on abs, delts, biceps, and triceps. split in a way that depends on how much volume I'm doing for all these muscles. So if I'm only doing, say, 12 sets, I might do I might train that particular muscle 3 times a week with 4 sets per day. That would be, for example, I think that's what I'm doing with my biceps. But if I'm doing something like 16 or 20 sets, like with my abs and lateral delts, I'm probably training them 4 or 5 days instead. Not probably. I don't know why I'm using these modifiers. I'm definitely training them 4 or 5 days instead. So basically, what I'm doing is quads and chest, back and hamstrings, quads and chest, back and hamstrings, quads and chest, which is really exciting. As of today, it's Thursday. I've already trained 4 times, so I tried 4 of the new sessions and I only have one left. I will say it does require some adjustment in that I'm not used to training upper and lower body in the same session. I haven't done it for years. When I started out back in 2018, I was training 3 times a week. I was lifting 3 times a week and I was doing 2 days of cardio. So I was still training 5 times total. So I was doing full body all 3 times, but I've not trained like that for years. So it is taking some adjustment, and something I've already noticed is that overall each session seems to be less fatiguing because I'm done with one half of my body much faster than I normally would be, in that my leg sessions would involve quads, hamstrings, and glutes, and those would be really intense. Whereas now, I am technically training my lower body every single day, but it's not taking up the whole session. And I find that it could be too early to say because it is literally just week one in this phase. But I wonder if this will mean that I'm going to be able to recover a little bit better and possibly handle more volume or see faster progressive overload on the same volume than I would be able to achieve previously when I was having individual leg days and individual upper body days. In any case, I'm really curious about how these sessions are going to pan out in terms of performance and recovery. And for now, I'm really excited about it, which is the most important thing at the end of the day, because if you're not excited, you're less likely to be consistent. Anyway, I started this new phase this week. I'm coming off of a deload, so I want to talk a little bit about how I approach week one. For me, week one after a deload is usually a time when my performance goes down a little bit. I found that not everyone, but some people respond like me. Even if they had maybe a couple of sessions during their deload week, they didn't take a full week off of the gym, once they go back into training, they still experience a little bit of a decrease in performance. And I say even if they were training during the deload week, because one hypothesis I had was, well, maybe it's because you don't have as much practice with the lifts. So your neuromuscular adaptations have reversed a bit, and you need your those neuromuscular adaptations to return before your body can express its full strength. In any case, regardless of how many sessions a person seems to do, some people seem to have this response where their performance is a little bit suppressed, even though you would think that because you've deloaded and you're less fatigued, it's the whole purpose of a deload at the end of the day, you would see a boost in performance. Well, that's not quite the case. It seems like the detraining effect of a deload might be stronger than the defatiguing effect in this situation. However, I usually find that after an initial week, my performance starts increasing again pretty consistently or pretty reliably. Also, another factor to consider is this reduction in performance seems to happen even if you're not majorly changing a training program. However, if you are making a major change like I'm doing, I would say that a reduction in performance on lifts that have stayed the same is pretty much a guarantee, because if you're making a reasonable or a significant change to your program, it means that you're doing maybe more volume for a certain muscle, or you're changing exercise selection. And for either of these reasons or both of these combined, even lifts that you were doing previously might be disadvantage now. So if you're doing more volume for a certain muscle, you need to adapt to that volume. And during the adaptation, performance can go down a little. Whereas if you change exercise order and previously you were doing an exercise first and now it's the fourth one, equally, you can't expect to perform the exact same way. That's why when I start a whole new program and when one of my clients does, I recommend taking a blank slate approach to where you don't want to completely forget about your performance in a previous phase. You still want to use it as a guideline to choose which weight to use to load on the bar. But I also wouldn't be too worried about any changes in performance in week number one, and I would use week number one as a new benchmark to compare future weeks against. A second consideration I make when I approach the start of a new program after a deload is because I am a little bit deconditioned, I don't need as much volume and proximity to failure to grow as I normally do. And potentially my normal amount of volume and intensity of effort could be a little bit too much for my body to recover from. So if I were to go balls to the wall right away from week number one with my usual volume and my usual intensity of effort, potentially I might be putting myself in a position where I'm accumulating more fatigue than I need to make progress, and that fatigue could bleed into future weeks and potentially even reduce the amount of time I can spend training productively because before I need another deload. So why would I risk that? It's just week number one, and as I've said, you don't need as much volume and proximity to failure to make progress when you're a little bit deconditioned, so why take the risk? It is a little bit frustrating for me personally. I love training hard, so holding back and reducing my volume and RPE isn't my favorite thing to do, but at the end of the day, I'm thinking of it in terms of long-term gratification over short-term gratification. I know that long-term this is likely a better approach, so that's why I'm taking it. And this is particularly important because I am increasing volume on certain muscle groups, and since they are not used to this amount of volume, I don't want to incur excessive soreness that is going to affect my performance if it is particularly intense. So this is how I'm approaching week number one so far. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to talk about how my nutrition is changing. Right now, the only change has been that I have increased my calories a little bit to get into a surplus. I do not believe at this moment in time that we need hundreds of calories of a surplus. And in fact, based on the research I'm aware of, which I've discussed on this podcast with some of the researchers themselves too, I don't believe that we need that many calories above maintenance, and in fact, achieving an excessively fast rate of gain is going to result in probably the same amount of muscle gain, but a much faster increase in your body fat, which is unnecessary. I also want to be able to bulk for months, as I've said, so that I can put on as much muscle as possible in this phase. I am also a pretty advanced athlete. I've been training for, it will be 8 years this June. So my ability to put on muscle is reduced relative to when I was more of a beginner. Therefore, there's no need to push for a big surplus and to gain weight fast because it's probably going to be a lot of fat for no particular reason. Last but not least, and this is something I've changed my mind on in recent years, I previously paid a lot more attention to achieving a specific rate of gain that I thought would be appropriate in terms of maximizing growth and minimizing fat gain. However, I've changed my stance on that, meaning if I intend to be in a surplus, or if I want a client to be in a surplus, we want to see some body weight gain over time. But I'm not concerned with achieving a certain speed of gain, meaning I'm not trying to push calories just to see the scale move if I'm seeing progressive overload. So, in other words, my focus has shifted, my priorities have shifted from a rate of gain on paper to progressive overload in the gym. Ultimately, again, training is the priority in a bulking phase because it is the only way that you're going to put on muscle. Without training, you could be in a surplus, you're not going to put on much muscle. Therefore, in hindsight, it doesn't really make much sense for me to prioritize the rate of gain that much when it should be the training that dictates any changes to your rate of gain and your nutrition, which ultimately affects the rate of gain. So, to say it in a third way, what I was doing without realizing was I was prioritizing nutrition and the size of the surplus over progressive overload and recovery. So again, I'm not saying that I no longer pay any attention to the rate of gain, but I'm also not concerned with making it happen at any particular speed if I'm seeing that myself or the client is seeing progressive overload, recovering well, and if their physique pictures are showing positive change. For example, somebody could be recomping, building muscle and losing fat at the same time. So the scale might not move at all. And if I were too focused on changes on the scale, I would be missing out on their ability to recomp and I would push for unnecessary fat gain at that point. So what I'm doing now instead is, yes, I'm putting myself in a surplus. I am realistically increasing my calories above what I think is my maintenance right now. But it's a smaller increase than I would have started with in the past when I was prioritizing seeing a certain speed of gain, because I'd rather be more conservative. And then if I don't see much movement increase over time, then start out too fast out of the gate for no particular reason. So I've settled on a small surplus, and what I am going to use in order to dictate any changes are the following tools to track progress. First of all, progressive overload in training and my ability to recover from it. Then visuals. I don't necessarily expect to be able to detect specific muscle growth because ultimately, if you are gaining weight and you are gaining some body fat, that body fat will sit on top of your muscles. And so, as a result of that, it's not like I have any illusions that I'm going to be able to notice, oh wow, my delts are exploding. How would I know that? Because if you're gaining both a little bit of fat and a little bit of muscle, and the fat sits on top of the muscle, your muscles could just be bigger because you have more fat on them. So in order to assess that I am specifically building more muscle, I'm going to have to wait to get leaner again and then compare that physique to a physique at the same body weight from previous years. For now, however, pictures are useful because I expect to see that my physique is going to get overall a little bit bigger over time. And that's going to help me identify whether I am indeed making progress in terms of gaining weight in this surplus, in addition to looking at my scale weights, but also it can help me identify whether I am indeed recomping, for example. Now that's going to happen because I really don't fit the criteria for a visible recomp over a number of weeks. It would be too short term of a situation for me to notice that, but I'm not gonna ignore that possibility. So visuals can help with that as well. In any case, they are going to help me alongside the scale to identify whether I am indeed in a bulking phase as I intend. And the final tool I'm going to use is, again, the scale. In terms of food choices, I've already talked a little bit about that. Now, the increase in calories is pretty minor. We're talking between 75 and 100 calories. So for me, just switching from the lower calorie ciabatta to the naan bread is enough to make a difference. However, I will also say that my food choices have also already been revolutionized. They were being revolutionized before this redemption arc ever started because, as I said, my maintenance calories went from 1800 to 2150 or so, which is insane. So obviously, with an extra 400 calories, I already made plenty of changes to my food selection way before I started this particular phase. That's why I don't have much to say about it now. And there was even a phase where my hunger in response to the initial increase in metabolism was so high that I ended up eating 22 to 2300 calories. And now I'm again in that ballpark, but it's a much smaller change than going from 1800 to 2200 compared to 2150 to 22 to 2300, which is why I don't have much to say on this because I feel like I've already made plenty of changes in the past. And in any case, eventually I will be going into a fat loss phase. And when we get to that phase in the redemption arc, In that future episode, I will talk way more about swaps and changes I'm making to the way I eat and my food selection, because I want to give you an insight into how to make that transition from maintenance into a deficit, because usually the discrepancy in calories is a bit larger. With a surplus, I normally assign anywhere between 75 and 150 calories to start with most clients, with an average of 100 calories extra. So it's really a moderate increase compared to what people are used to. It's as much as an extra scoop of protein powder or a banana. But with a deficit, we usually try to target around 250, 300 calories less than maintenance to start with. So there are larger changes to the diet that occur. In any case, I want to cover those in a future episode. For now, I want to close this episode with what to expect from this particular redemption arc bulking phase. Expect that I will talk about how I've been doing the same thing over and over for a long time, because that's what generates the best conditions for muscle growth at the end of the day. It's following a program for long enough that you can see progressive overload with it, and you can get better at it as well, because even though I've been training for a long time, a change in program can still be pretty significant, and I will need to maybe adjust this phase a little bit to make sure that it fits my time constraints and my preferences and my ability to recover. I'm also implementing some exercises I haven't done in a while, so I need to basically regroove. No, how do I want to say? What do I want to say? Basically, oil the groove again, get back into a groove with them. Basically, not necessarily relearn them from scratch, but just practice them and get as good as I used to be with them. So, for all of these reasons, you want to give yourself time to really practice the same training program. And ultimately, with your nutrition, I've talked about the importance of having the same meal structure. So, that's not going to change. Yes, my food choices are going to vary because I want to have different fruit and vegetables and slightly different food choices every now and again to have a diverse diet. But I'm not going to have completely different meals every day or every week, because that takes a long time that I don't have to worry about that. And it just increases food focus for no reason. I really want to prioritize focusing on the rest of my life and focusing on progressive overload in the gym. Oh, and that actually brings up something I haven't brought up. Something that's not changing for me is I'm keeping the same steps, so same 10,000 step target per day, and the same sleep routine as well. Now, some might think that doing the same thing over and over again sounds boring, but I think it's exciting. And at the end of this phase, I'm going to get to see the sculpture I've created by repeating these behaviors over and over again. And that is really rewarding for me, and it makes me really enjoy this lifestyle. And ultimately, I just like doing the same thing every day. And so it does fall in line with my own personal preferences, which obviously biases me towards thinking, hey, this is great. Anyway, final takeaway that I want to end the podcast with is the following. Even though I've mentioned that I don't think I managed to fulfill my muscle growth potential for years now because of everything that I've described at the beginning, I do I do know that I have built muscle. And I say no and not think, because it's undeniable. If you put side by side my pictures from 2022 compared to now, I have built a lot more muscle. Could it have been more if the conditions had been more favorable? I think so. But I have still built muscle. So my final takeaway is this. Your bodybuilding journey might not be the perfect sequence of cuts and bulks. And to be honest, for a lot of people, that's not the case because life happens. However, if you show up and you do your best to train regularly, consistently, and hard enough, and you also do your best to manage your diet so that you don't lose huge amounts of weight or gain huge amounts of weight, even if you can't cut and bulk with the granularity that you would like. And I am a granular person, in case you haven't noticed. Even though you may not be able to achieve that degree of precision that would be your preference, as long as you show up, you're going to see results. And in fact, if you want to see mine, I'm planning on making a reel to raise awareness around this episode, and I am posting it on Friday. I'm also releasing the episode on Friday. So if you go on my Instagram account, you will be able to see it, so you can see the comparison in terms of muscle growth. Because in that reel, I am going to put to do a side-by-side comparison of my physique between 22 and now. On that note, that is all. You have listened to over an hour of me nerding out about my own life, my own bodybuilding process, and bodybuilding in general. I really hope that this was valuable and you took something from it. If you like this style of personal updates type podcast episodes, comment on this particular episode, whether on YouTube or on a podcast platform that lets you leave comments, because I love to know. If I know that people enjoy it, that will motivate me to do it more. If I know that you don't enjoy it so much or you don't care, equally this is helpful because I will prioritize the redemption arc a little bit less, and I will prioritize educational content a bit more, or rather more generic educational content, and content that's less specific to my own process. Finally, fun fact, this episode is going to be called the Prelude, and every episode afterwards will be called Chapter 1, 2, 3, etc. Because, if you don't know, in my free time I write fantasy novels, so of course I'm going to title this redemption arc as though it's going to be a novel. And now I am really done. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you soon. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.